Hi, in the last video I showed you how to extract functions into static methods in the controller and in the utils class. Now I want to move on to extract more interesting objects. And the object we are going to extract this time is the object that refers to rendering the game board. And that has to do with the render function and also with this part that is loading the initial board. So we are going to extract these two responsibilities into its own object. And I'm going to call this object the game element. Why element? Well, because it's an element, an HTML element in the page. So that's to distinguish the game that is modeling the game rules that will come later. So for this guy, we have a load method, and the load method is going to do this part. Okay, so I'm going to extract this. Now this is going to be game element load. And notice that here I'm referring to an instance of game element. That is because in theory you could try to load multiple games on the same screen. Suppose you have some sort of multiplayer thing that you want to render two games in the same screen. So different from the controller that had only static methods, this time I do want to have some object here. So for the moment, I'm just going to have game element at the top level. And of course, I need to declare this after the definition of the class. So I'm going to do it down here. And it's a constant because after I define the game element, it's the same. I'm never changing it. I mean, I can ask it to render again and everything, but the loading of the board only happens once, and that's when this happens, and that's the end of it. So when the page loads, now it takes this game element, that's an instance of this class, and calls load on it. And as I said, you could try to load multiple game elements on the same page. So instead of just hard coding that it needs to render in the body, I'm going to extract this into a target element. And when we call load, then we pass that as an argument. So now we can render the game element multiple times in different targets. And I'm also going to store this target for later to use on another method. And this method is going to be the render method. And it's similar to this guy here, board, is the argument. And I do this part. So exactly, I'm just exactly extracting the render function, okay? And now again, instead of looking up the buttons in the document, I'm going to look up the buttons in the target. That's why I stored target for later. Okay, so now when I load, I remember the target on which this element loaded, and then I can look up buttons in that target. So if there are multiple games, then I would be looking up, if there are multiple games in the same screen, I would be looking up the buttons in different targets. Maybe I would need to change this to not look by ID, but look by some other attribute, but we are not going there. At least the foundation is here. Now we have the possibility of having different games on the page. Next, what we want to do is to call the render function correctly. So we are calling the render function here. Now we no longer call the render function at the top level, that is gone. So we are going to call it on the game element render. And we pass the board as usual. So this part is the same. And now we can render this game element. Well, notice how this game element really refers to the whole game. And the game could have other things besides the board. It could have a move counter, for instance. Anytime you click on a light, it increments that counter. So it would be more appropriate to, instead of receiving the board as an argument, we receive the game as an argument. And anytime we need to refer to the board, we just say game.board. Okay? And now when calling render, we don't need to call it with the board, we call it with the whole game. That is a more principled way of rendering. Another thing I need to change before I test this in the browser is that when we were using document, it had this getElementById method, but the target is the result of query selector here in this case. So the target doesn't have the getElementById method. It does have a query selector, and if we use the sharp symbol, then this is selecting an ID. That's the selector for IDs. So now we can save this, go back to the browser and test if this is still working, and it is. The board shows up and I can move, I can cheat, I can create new games. It's all working. So at this point, we extracted the game element. There is one more object we want to extract here, and that is an object that is capable of talking to the server. So you can notice here in our controller, we are talking to the server and we are calling the rendering and we are waiting and pulling, and the controller is doing too much. It knows how to talk to the server, how to talk to the elements. It knows too much. So we are going to extract an object that has the purpose of communicating to the server. And that is the topic of our next video.